My name is Florian Kratke from the European Centre for Development Policy Management.
And I'm Bruno Wenn, I'm the chairman of the European Development Finance Institute.
Thank you, Bruno, for agreeing to speak with us, and you introduced yourself already.
My pleasure.
Thank you. It's good to have someone here from the European Development Finance Institute's association or platform. And the first question, of course, would be, what is this organization and what does it do?
This is an organization of 15 European Development Finance Institutes from Finland up to Portugal, and we have a combined portfolio of 26 billion of long-term loans and equity in developing countries, and about 1/3 is in Africa, and about 1/3 is also in the financial sector to promote small and medium-sized enterprises. And we as association, have developed our joint standards. So
Yes.
we have everything that's harmonized, so we work on the same procedures, so we can also then easily arrange for co-financing if there is a need amongst us. And in order to promote this a little bit more and also develop all these standards a little bit more and to push a little bit the harmonization agenda, we have different working groups and networking groups, so people are coming together. There's a lot of staff exchange of experience. This is in the benefit of the smaller members we have, because then they can benefit from, let me say, the huge experience of larger institutions like DEG, FMO or Proparco.
Okay, very interesting. We've spoken, over this day, and I'm sure also tomorrow, a lot about blending and the EU's increasing interest in this financing modality for development. Now, as we know, there are various definitions of this modality, but I'd like to ask you in a general way, what do you perceive as the benefits, the potential benefits, and also the potential risks of blending?
The potential benefits, as we see it in the European Development Finance Institute, is that the European Commission could use the vast potential they have in terms of grant funding to promote much more private sector development in developing countries, simply by helping governments to create an enabling environment for the private sector, by helping to create the business environment, by helping to create a dialogue between the public sector and the private sector, which is very helpful in discussing all the necessary issues where there are bottlenecks as perceived by the private sector and where the private sector expect that the government is delivering in terms of reducing the cost of doing business.
Yes.
And by doing that, the European Commission could be extremely helpful, because a better enabling environment reduces the risk of the private sector to do business. For the local private sector, but also for European or the international private sector. And this is why we believe this is the advantage if, for example, the European Commission is providing funds which helps governments to create an enabling environment, for example, in the creating a regulator framework which enables then the private sector to finance renewable energies.
Precisely, yeah.
With less risk. And there are also, of course, always risk involved, and we as European Development Finance Institutes are always a little bit of concerned if grants are being used in order to provide subsidies to the private sector, which might undermine then the market, and in our view is not a real incentive system to provide sustainable development in the future.
Okay. We've spoken just now of risks, and we've spoken of projects. And here today at the European Development Days, there are various different parties. There's people traditionally from the development sector, there's the private sector, there are think tanks, there are academia, everyone is present, and everyone has a different definition of these terms. So now I would like to ask you, what do you think that the traditional development scene needs to understand about the functioning of the private sector in order to make blending a success?
I think what is not well understood is that the private sector has a lot of advantage not only in terms of financing, but also simply in terms of management. They know how to run a water supply company. They know what is needed in order to provide sustainable water supply also to the very poor.
Yeah.
Because this is what is their business, and to make use of these vast experience of the private sector in order to provide long-term solutions, which helps us also to make growth more inclusive. This is a valuable source which is not well understood, because there's a lot of misunderstanding that the private sector, because the private sector is profit-oriented, and the private sector need profit because in order to be sustainable over time, that because he's profit-oriented, he is not part of the development agenda. We say that the private sector is part of the development agenda. Why? 90% of the jobs are created in the private sector, not in the public sector. So in order to generate as much as possible jobs, and jobs are needed in developing countries. So for the young people, we need to support much more private sector development in form from small and medium-sized enterprises. And jobs are then the vehicle to promote much more the inclusiveness of economic growth. Because through jobs, the private sector generates income, and income is then one of the growth patterns in development. So once again, there's a lot of misunderstandings, and this is why I believe that the European Development Days are so important, because there's a platform for exchange and there's a platform for dialogue, and dialogue is needed also in order to build up some trust and some confidence amongst all the participants. Final point I would like to say is from the private sector side, we do not argue that the private sector is the solution. We always say we need the public sector in order to create the regulatory framework and also be able to control what the private sector is doing in terms of respecting the laws and environmental standards and labor standards, etc. We need a civil society as a watchdog, and then we need the private sector. So working together in this triangle, this is extremely important. And the more we can put this triangle in best practice, then we can contribute more to better development and larger development impact.
Okay, that's clear. Talking about this triangle and the best practice, I'm wondering if you have an example of a project that you particularly like, or which is a particularly good example of how blending can be used for a better development impact.
My favorite example is what we have achieved within the German development assistance, in which we have used technical assistance in order to help the government in Senegal to restructure the energy sector in a way to allow the private sector to come in, so that the private sector now is allowed to generate power, is allowed to feed in the power into the grid, is allowed to distribute and to transmit power. And this has generated a tremendous demand by the private sector to invest.
Okay.
And even in rural areas, and since we know that 60% of the people in Africa do not have access to power, I think using the opportunities of the private sector could be extremely helpful.
Okay, good. Well, let's hope that all projects through blending facilities will turn out to be more in that fashion. Thank you very much for speaking with us.